Hello, my lovely psychology students. Here we're doing a little bit of research methods. So remember, these notes that you make here will go into your research method section within your folder. And we're just going to have a look at variables. And the variables that we're going to look at is the IV, the independent variable, the DV, the dependent variable, extraneous variables, and confounding variables. So this is you getting to know the type of variables that we will have in a piece of research. So let's understand variables. What is a variable? It's a very good question, and I know you will all know that a variable can be anything that can alter, change, or vary in any shape or form. For example, you might have a chair that's got high legs, but actually that can change if you saw the legs and make them shorter. So really, it can be anything. I know it's a silly example that can alter or change. So in order for research to establish cause and effect, there has to be two key variables, and I know you know what they are. And these need to be isolated, so that means clearly identified. They need to be manipulated and measured. And these are the independent variable and the dependent variable. You're very familiar with these from your science days at school. Now, the independent variable is the variable that is being manipulated by the researcher. So the IV is set in different variants, and these are known as conditions. So each setting of the IV is known as a condition. So again, use your electronic textbook. Let's look up a definition of conditions. And when it comes to an IV, there will always be two settings: with chocolate, without chocolate, with noise, without noise, with music, without music. So there's always going to be two conditions. And it's about to see whether these conditions have an impact on the DV. Remember, DV stands for dependent variable. Now, the dependent variable is the variable that is being measured by the researcher. IV is the one that's manipulated. The DV is the one that is measured. So whether the setting of the IV actually has had an impact on the DV. So for example, noise is the IV. Did that affect the person's concentration in getting as many of the spot the differences correct? Or no music? And then we record how many of spot the differences they managed to get. So the DV is to see whether the IV has had an influence on it, and it's the one that's being measured by the researcher. Now, when it comes to variables, an easy way to remember the IV and the DV, the difference between them. What is the researcher measuring? It's the DV. What is the researcher manipulating or changing? It's the IV. Now, in a piece of research, we have the IV and the DV, but all the other variables are known as extraneous variables. Remember, let's add this to your glossary as well. And that means it's all of every other variable that's within the research itself. These are known as extraneous variables. And it is of utmost importance that these extraneous variables are controlled. That's why a laboratory experiment is so good, because of the high level of control. They control every single variable within the research. Now, extraneous variables can come in different shapes and forms. So it could be everything from what's happening in the environment, so situational, time of day, temperature, noise level, or dispositional. It's got to do with the person, their disposition, so their age, their gender, their ethnicity. All of these can actually have an impact on their ability to carry it out. So these need to be controlled. Now, if these aren't being controlled, they can become what is known as a confounding variable. Now, a confounding variable you do not want in your research. So remember, Extraneous variables are all the other variables except the IV and the DV in your piece of research. If these are not controlled, one of those extraneous variables could become what is now known as a confounding variable. And a confounding variable, like I've just said, is an uncontrolled extraneous variable. Now, this becomes the problem. And the reason why this is the problem is that the confounding variable might manipulate the DV, so the dependent variable, alongside the IV, therefore affecting the overall results. Now, what does that mean? Now, we know, for example, if we were measuring a person's concentration, and we had a condition with no noise and one with noise. But if we didn't control the time of day, perhaps the research was carried out. So one group did it at 9 o'clock in the morning, but the other group did it at 9 o'clock at night. Well, at 9 o'clock at night, they're going to become very tired compared to 9 o'clock in the morning. So that's going to affect the DV as well. So we're not going to get a true comparison. And because of the time of day, so the person becomes more tired, they're not going to do as well as the people that are alert at 9 o'clock in the morning. So we would have to control, if we didn't control the time of day, that is an uncontrolled extraneous variable that might actually have an effect on the DV. So therefore, the data we're getting when recording the DV might not be a true representation because it's going to be affected by the time of night. So what the researcher would do to control this is make sure that the condition with no noise was done at 9 o'clock in the morning and the condition with noise was done at 9 o'clock in the morning as well. And then everybody will be at the same level of alertness and it's not going to affect them. Quick recap, an extraneous variables, all the other variables in the study except the IV and the DV. If they are not controlled, they become confounding variables. And a problem with the confounding variables, it might have an impact on the DV alongside the IV. So we're not getting a true understanding of the effects of the IV on the DV. Now, I know it sounds a bit complicated, but take your time to get your head around it. It's actually not that complicated. Oh, sorry, I seem to have a hiccups. Now, what I want to do, a nice little task. We've done 3 key study sheets so far. We've done one on Bandura and the Bobo doll. We've done the Skinner box, and we've done Pavlov's dogs. What I would like you to do is go into each of your key study sheets, and where it says additional information, I would like you to identify the IV and the DV for each of these studies. So go back and think to yourself, the IV is the thing the researcher is manipulating. By the thing, I mean the variable. And the DV is what they are measuring. IV manipulating, DV measuring. So over to you. Stop the video now and let's do that. Right, I really hope that you've paused the video to do that. So let's move on. Now, you heard me talking a few moments ago about extraneous variables, and we have different types of extraneous variables. So we have 2 categories of extraneous variables. We have what is known as dispositional variables and situational variables. Now, dispositional variables, if you simplify down a little bit further, disposition. And when we talk about a person's disposition, we're talking about features of that person. So things to do with the person. So therefore, if we were doing an IQ test and we had participants that were 10 years old and participants that were 25 years old, don't you think the age would impact on their results? Because we would expect the 25-year-old to do better than the 10-year-old. So age is a dispositional factor. It's got to do with the person. And we have lots of different dispositional age, intelligence, ethnicity, gender, even when it comes to things like height, right? Everything has got to do with that person. The other classification of extraneous variables are situational variables. Situational, situation. If we're in a situation, it's something that's happening around us, so really that applies to the environment. So these are all the variables within the environment. So it could be things like noise, temperature, for example, the type of room that we use for an experiment, the amount of information that's on the walls, and the time of day, right? So there are lots of different types of extraneous variables. To classification, dispositional, it's got to do with the person, and situational variables. So what I'd like you to do is let's write up your notes, go to the electronic textbook, log on, have a read about these different types of variables, go into the glossary as well, add the key terms in. And what I'd like you to do now for a little task here with regards to situational and dispositional, I have given you an example of two. So when you're making your notes, I would like you to give me two more examples. Situational, something that could affect the research in the environment, and dispositional, it's got to do with the person. So let's make up your notes, use the electronic textbook, use the classroom notebook because there's some information on there, and use this video to make your notes. And once you've done that, there is a nice little task that allows you to identify what the IV and what the DV is of the research. Till next time, work well.